How's everybody doing out there? I'm glad I could be with you this evening. Um, this is a webinar on the 1920s. My name is Jeff Kampf. I'm with a company called Lifelong Cognition, and I'm a professor of history. And this is right up my alley. The 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, is a lot of fun to study. So let's get right to it. We're going to look at some slides. We're going to do a PowerPoint, an overview right now, and give you some information about the 1920s. The election of 1920, Warren Harding was the Republican. His quote was a return to normalcy. Sound familiar? Anyway, James Cox was the Democrat. And Eugene V. Debs was actually a contender for the presidency running as a socialist. He received 913,664 votes despite incarceration. Quite an interesting election. So you see the Republican Party is Harding and Democratic Cox. You see the different colors, and you see the electoral vote, popular vote, and how that came out. Obviously, Warren Harding became the president of the United States. Warren Harding, 1921 to 1923, our president. A return to normalcy. Let me ask you to think about why his motto was a return to normalcy. I'll give you a second. Well, what happened in the years prior to 1921? Obviously, World War I played a very big impact, and the pandemic. Interesting relativity here. Ford E. McCumber tariff, known for a tariff which was placed in 1922, the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, the Washington Naval Conference from 1922 to 1923, the Teapot Dome scandal. We're going to be talking a lot about this. Harding died in office, and Calvin Coolidge then assumed the presidency. So in the election of 1924, Calvin Coolidge, again, there was a booming economy. Conservatism was popular at that time. John W. Davis was the Democrat, Democrats split between conservatives and liberals. And we know that Coolidge won a second term. Calvin Coolidge, a Republican, served from 1923 to 1928. The business of the American people is business. And again, we know why that was his motto. We're going to be talking a lot about industry and about our industrial revolution. This was big changes in the 1920s. Known for the National Origins Act in 1924, the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. The election of 1928, we see Herbert Hoover, again, a Republican. Al Smith, big contender from the Democrats, first Catholic major party candidate. And again, we see that the Republicans sort of blew it out there with the popular vote of 21,000, 58% versus 41%. Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover served from 1929 to 1933. Quote, given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Unfortunately, during his time, we see the Great Depression, voluntarism, the stock market crash of 1929, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932, and the Bonus Army in 1932 as well. We're going to go into that. So, an American consumer society. Welfare capitalism, real income increases, higher rate for owners, managers, and skilled labor, minimal increased rates for unskilled labor and working class, insurance, profit sharing, worker safety, decreased influence of unions. Again, this was a consumer society, mass production, something brand new, obviously driven by the automobile, a wide variety and availability of consumer products at affordable prices. The Model T, domestic appliances, installment plans, and again, the impact of the automobile. Henry Ford. So some posters. How's your breath today? Listerine. We know what that is today. We still have it around. Ford, cut your costs. Old gold cigarettes. And there you see Babe Ruth. Consumerism, right? Consumer ads for the young businessman. Notice the car. This incredible Ford Roundabout only cost $265. Wouldn't that be nice today? In the 1920 society, blacks obviously were coming out of Reconstruction. There's a lot of white resentment. Lynchings increased, especially in the South. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, also known as the UNIA. Marcus Garvey was very influential. Economic solidarity and advancement for blacks, but it a failed attempt of mass migration to Africa. Again, this idea of mass migration to Africa, Liberia, it just didn't work out. And Liberia today, again, established by American blacks in the 1920s, is one of the poorest nations in the world. Inspired by black pride and black nationalism. The 1920s society was also known for immigration. We see the first Red Scare and nativism. Nativism, the definition of nativism is this idea that, Americans were native to the country and that immigrants absolutely did not belong here. Again, does this sound familiar? There were quota laws. The Emergency Quota Act of 1929, 3% of the 1910 census. That's all that was allowed. The National Origins Act in 1924, only 2% immigration of the 1890 census. We had the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Again, 1920 to 27, 2 Italian immigrants executed for murder despite little evidence. And it was strictly out of hatred for immigrants and nativism, this whole idea of nationalism and nativism. Xenophobia is a good way to think about this. And in the cartoon, we see Europe immigration, we see the opening of the funnel, and there is Uncle Sam at the gate, only allowing 3%, of immigrants to come into the United States. I guess it would have been hard to put a wall across the ocean. 1920, women. Yesterday, we celebrated the 19th Amendment. I wore white. The 19th Amendment voting usually voted as husbands. Not too legal, but they absolutely did get away with it. Politicians catered to female-friendly legislation and programs. Clerical, teachers, nurses, domestic servants, this is the type of employment. A lot of secretaries, lower wages, and no managerial positions. Margaret Sanger, big on the American Birth Control League, established Planned Parenthood. I'll throw in Emma Goldman into that mix. Emma Goldman, not mentioned here, was a big activist for the right of women to make their own decision on when to have children, and birth control, which was illegal in the 1920s. Birth control was illegal. Here we have a picture of a flapper girl, young women of the jazz age, short hair, short hemline, cosmetics, the cigarettes. We see this incredible 1920s look, and music, and the jazz age was very big at this time. When we think about culture wars, we have to mention Prohibition. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act in the 1920s, supported by the middle class, progressives, and rural Protestants, especially in the South and West, but was generally ignored in urban centers. And again, you know about the speakeasies, those underground saloons. Most of them were in Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, in the urban centers. We see that bootleggers and rum runners smuggled alcohol. We all know Al Capone, the rise of organized crime, Joe Kennedy. There's so many. Just watch HBO's series Boardwalk Empire. So in the 1920s, we do have a lot, again, of xenophobia, white supremacy. The KKK were very prominent here. We see many pictures and posters of the KKK. We see sheet music and phonograph records and player rolls for the piano, basically promoting white supremacy in the Ku Klux Klan. Here we see June 14th, 1924, the Spring Festival in Pleasant Valley Park, which was in Wisconsin. And again, the KKK is still very prominent in that area. We see the defender of here, the poster of, I think that says the 18th Amendment. I'm not sure what that, I can't see it. But again, the KKK absolutely were very prevalent and prominent in the 1920s. Religion, fundamentalism, literal view of Bible, creationism, attacked urban lifestyle and culture, revivalists like Billy Sunday, Amy Semple McPherson, modernism, the liberal view of religion, acceptance and coordination of science and context with faith, and of course the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, the law against teaching of evolution in Tennessee public school, where it was Scopes versus, again, the public school system. A creationism by William Jennings Bryan, and of course, evolution, Clarence Darrow. The monkey trial, right? What would their verdict be if they were apes as jurors? So this was a really, really interesting time culturally, and basically it was religion versus science. Again, a lot of relativity to what's going on today with the COVID virus. Do we listen to the scientists, or do we listen to the conspiracy theories centering around science? It's almost like come full circle, hasn't it? So again, when we think about hero worship, you got to mention Babe Ruth, athletes, celebrities, innovators, fame for individual accomplishment, personification of American individualism. Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh, read The Plot Against America or watch the miniseries The Plot Against America. Charles Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. He was a individual who was anti-war. He did not want us to go into World War II, and really changed a lot of people's perceptions and challenged Roosevelt. Absolutely did not want to get into the war. Was given a medal by Adolf Hitler, and created a lot of division in our politics in the 1920s. Fueled the tabloid and gossip columns in newspapers and magazines. And of course, we know I live right here in Hillsborough, New Jersey, and right up the street, right up the road, is Charles Lindbergh's home in Hopewell, and we all know about the kidnapping and the murder of his son. So again, the culture wars, the jazz age. You'll see Al Jolson on the right there, the jazz singer. Yes, blackface. Blackface was accepted. And there is a lot of controversy about blackface. We see jazz such as Louis Armstrong really become popular. George Gershwin, speakeasies, dance clubs. We had the waltz, the foxtrot, and my grandmother's favorite dance, the Charleston. She loved the Charleston. Josephine Baker, a wonderful, wonderful entertainer. And of course, we saw the Flappers. Incredible culture when it comes to music and dance. Radio, we start to see radio become popular. It becomes mainstream. Networks such as NBC and CBS. We start to see the beginning of the talkies, the jazz singer. Again, you see Al Jolson in blackface in the jazz singer. Nickelodeons, and of course, Charlie Chaplin, who became an incredible actor, but also owned a large movie studio in Brooklyn and eventually moved it to California, LA. One caveat about Al Jolson and blackface, and even Judy Garland performed in blackface. There is another side to blackface, and it's something that I like to mention because it's so important. Blacks were not allowed to perform their incredible music and dance in white theaters. And yet white folks, like myself, loved the blues, loved jazz, and loved black music and entertainment. Well, how would we see that? How would we get a taste of black culture if they're not allowed to perform in our white theaters? Well, that's why blackface also existed, because entertainers would pretend to be blacks and entertain us using black music and dance and tap, and it would be like watching blacks actually performing. It's a sick commentary, but blackface, very popular in the 1920s. Literature, well, again, delusion by World War I and consumerism and modernism. Ernest Hemingway becomes very, very popular. The Sun Also Rises, probably one of his best books. A Farewell to Arms, Sinclair Lewis Babbitt, of course, The Great Gatsby, and we all know, and I hope you saw the film, The Great Gatsby, the old film, and even an updated version of The Great Gatsby, and the story of the 1920s. The Harlem Renaissance, incredible, fueled by the Great Migration to Chicago and to New York, and inspired by Black pride. Themes challenged racist stereotypes, the idea that Black is beautiful. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and the New Negro, an interpretation in 1925. And if it wasn't for the Harlem Renaissance, we wouldn't have incredible musicians like Duke Ellington, the Cotton Club, and I can go on and on and on. The Harlem Renaissance was absolutely an amazing migration to the city of New York, to Harlem, and you were able to again experience incredible Black culture, food as well. We had lots of restaurants, and again, unfortunately, Blacks couldn't come to us, but whites could go if they could get over the stigma and the fear. They could go to the Apollo in Harlem and check out some of the Black artists. But again, this was an amazing time. So I hope you enjoyed that PowerPoint. Right now, we're going to look at the politics of the 1920s. And if you think our politics are bad now, let me tell you, the 1920s were absolutely very, very divisive, as you saw in the previous PowerPoint, a lot of cultural wars, etc. The American post-war issues. After World War I, the American public was exhausted. The public debate over the League of Nations divided America. An economic downturn meant many faced unemployment. Again, nativism, this idea of a white American country swept the nation. This idea that immigration and immigrants were evil. Nativism was terrible, xenophobia. And in turn, isolationism. Many Americans adopted a belief that we should put up a wall. This meant pulling away from involvement in world affairs. The U.S. foreign policy reverted to a unilateral idea, isolationism. We really just, thought of ourselves. Again, I find it very relative to today's politics. A fear of communism. Well, one perceived threat to American life was the spread of communism. The Red Scare, an economic and political system based on a single government party, equal distribution of resources, the prohibition of private property, and rule by a dictatorship. This fear of communism and the Red Summer and, again, the Red Scare or Red Fear, whatever you want to call it, came out of unions. Unions were becoming very popular amongst lower class workers. It gave them support. It gave them a little bit more say in their life and the way they lived their lives and the way they worked. And industrialists who were very wealthy felt threatened by unions, sort of a socialist concept, unions. And that definitely helped spread this fear of communism. Communism in the Soviet Union, of course, in 1917, the last year of World War I, a revolution in Russia, transformed the nation into a communist state known as the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks and overthrew the Tsarist regime. He was inspired by Marxism, again, a radical form of socialism that advocated violence. A communist party was formed in America, and again, that really threw gasoline on the fire as well. People feared that the communists were going to take over America. Again, we mentioned Sacco and Vanzetti. Fear of communism took the form of a Red Scare, anti-communist hysteria, and fed nativism into America. That nativism produced this unbelievable, a lot of people didn't believe it happened. A lot of people did not see the evidence, and they thought it was a conspiracy against two Italian anarchists. They called them anarchists at the time, Sacco and Vanzetti. A shoemaker and a fish peddler were convicted of robbery and murder. And again, despite flimsy evidence, their execution was a symbolic, of discrimination against radical beliefs during the Red Scare and immigration. Sad story. We can do a lecture just on Sacco and Vanzetti and the xenophobic, perspective of many Americans in the 1920s. Again, the Ku Klux Klan was very prominent as the Red Scare and anti-immigration, laws and attitudes reached a peak. The KKK was more popular than ever. By 1924, the Klan had 4.5 million members. Congress limited immigration, and in response to nativist pressure, Congress decided to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921. It was established as a quota system to control and restrict immigration. And America changed its formerly permissive immigration policy. It went from, I believe it was in the hundreds of thousands down to only 25,000 immigrants per year. A time of labor unrest. Again, I mentioned unions. Strikes were outlawed during World War I. However, in 1919, there were more than 3,000 strikes involving 4 million workers. The unions were starting to have a lot more say. And again, through striking and through demonstrations, many of them violent, people died. The unions became a way of American life. A little caveat, a big union organizer and supporter was Charlie Chaplin, and he used his studio to make films about the support of the unions. So the Boston police strike Not received a raise in years, the Boston police, and were denied the right to unionize. And in response, excuse me, to the strike, the city called the National Guard and hired all new policemen. That was big, big. The steel mill strike. In September 1919, the United States Steel Corporation refused to meet with union representatives, and in response, over 300,000 workers went on strike. Scabs, known as people who crossed the picket line, were hired, and strikers were beaten by police and federal troops. The strike was settled in 1920 with an 8-hour day, but still no union. The coal miners' strike in 1919, United Mine Workers, led by John Lewis, you see a picture of him there, called a strike. Lewis met with an arbitrator appointed by President Wilson. Lewis won a 27% pay raise, and he was hailed as a hero. In the 1920s, again, it was tough for unions. 1920s hurt labor movement. Union membership dropped from 5 million to 3.5 million. Well, why? African Americans were excluded from membership, and immigrants were willing to work in very poor conditions because that's all they had. Here we see a picture of the Ford foundry workers in 1926. Only 1% of Black workers were in unions at the time. So the Harding presidency, let's talk a little bit about the politics of Warren Harding. Again, a modest success included the Kellogg-Briand Act, which renounced war as a means of national policy. It was signed by 15 nations, but was difficult to enforce. And the Dawes Plan, which solved the problem of post-war debt by providing loans to Germany and to pay France, Britain, who then paid us back. Again, World War I was devastating economically to Europe. So the international financial system under the Dawes Plan from 1924 to 1930, you see that the U.S. supplied $2.6 billion of war debt payments, and it was paid back by Europe, but it really helped them. So a scandal hit Harding. The president's main problem was that he didn't understand the issues. Several of Harding's appointees were caught illegally selling government supplies to private companies. We know that that's a no-no. And again, the Teapot Dome scandal. This was huge. The worst case of corruption was the Teapot Dome scandal. In fact, I just heard references to the Teapot Dome scandal on the news last week. The government set aside oil-rich public land in Teapot, Wyoming. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased the land to 2 oil companies. Fall received $400,000 from the oil companies, and he was convicted in federal court. It was a felony conviction. The business of America, again, the new president, Calvin Coolidge, the spirit of the 1920s was very good. Again, his famous quote, "The chief business in the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there." Business was huge in the 1920s. The Industrial Revolution, all of the new inventions. Both Coolidge and his Republican successor, Herbert Hoover, favored government policies that kept taxes down and business profits up. Tariffs were high, which helped American manufacturers. Government interference in business was minimal. Wages were increasing. It was a real, what we call a laissez-faire atmosphere. Laissez-faire, hands off, let business flourish. Hands off, government should be in the background. Let business be business. The impact of the auto, again, I can't stress how important the Model T Ford was to our economy. The auto was the backbone of the American economy from 1920 through 1970s. It also profoundly altered the American landscape and society. The Ford Model T was the first car in America. It came only in black, and it sold for only $290. Over 15 million were sold by 1927. So again, paved roads, traffic lights, motels, billboards. Think of Route 66. I get my kicks on Route 66. Home design. Every home needed a driveway and a garage. If you had a car, you needed a garage. gas stations, repair shops, shopping centers, freedom for rural families who otherwise couldn't get around, independence for women and young people. Cities like Detroit, Flint, Michigan, Akron, Ohio grew. By 1920, 80% of the world's vehicles were in the United States. Airline transport becomes common. The airline industry began as a mail-carrying service and quickly took off. By 1927, Pan American Airways was making the transatlantic passenger flights. Commercial flights began. All flight attendants were female, and of course, they were white. Here we see a great picture of some attendants. The American standard of living soared in the years 1920 to 1929. These were prosperous ones for the United States, prosperous rather. They were also prosperous, but it was prosperous. Americans owned 40% of the world's wealth. The average annual income rose 35% during the 1920s, from $522 annually to $705. Discretionary income increased. So when we think about buying a house for, oh my God, $600, $1,000, $705 is quite a jump. Electric conveniences. Again, while gasoline powered much of the economic boom of the 1920s, the use of electricity also transformed the nation. Electric refrigerators, stoves, irons, toasters, vacuums, washing machines, sewing machines, electric toasters. The electric light bulb changed many, many times. Edison's original bulb changed to the Westinghouse bulb. AC/DC, the great battle. I do a lecture on the Battle of AC/DC and how electricity transformed our nation and eventually our world. The modern advertising emerges. Ad agencies no longer sought to merely inform the public about their products, but they hired psychologists to study how best to appeal to Americans' desire for youthful beauty, health, wealth. The Say It with Flower slogan actually doubled sales between 1912 and 1924. And again, a superficial prosperity. Many during the 1920s believed the prosperity would go on forever. Wages, production, gross national product, and the stock market all rose significantly, but we know problems on the horizon. Businesses expanded recklessly. Again, not thinking about spending all this money. Iron and railroad industries faded. Farms nationwide suffered losses due to overproduction. Too much was brought on by credit, including stocks. We had the problems out west and in the Midwest with the Dust Bowl. We had, of course, eventually a Great Depression. So interesting politics. And again, very interesting how this has come full circle. I see a lot of similarities in today's political environment. I think we're going through many of the same divisions and nativity and nativism, nationalism produces a lot of division, and that's really not, I personally don't think that that's what America is about. So right now we're going to look at a couple of videos. We're going to see how we lived in the 1920s. These are two wonderful videos. The second video is called America, the 1920s in Color, and I'm sure a lot of you haven't seen it. It just came out, and I thought I would bring it to you today. So let's start the videos. This is how we lived in the 1920s. I'm going to sign off for a few minutes and enjoy this, and I'll come back to you.
Every 10 years, the census takers knock on front doors across America to find out who we are and where we're going. The 1920 census told us that for the first time, we were almost equally spread between our great cities and life on the land. Lots of us were living in small towns, and small towns were changing too. The Great War was over, and many doughboys back from France were still adjusting to peace and the new prosperity. For those in farming communities, there were new problems. The Great Plains had been plowed up to raise wheat for the armies fighting the war. But with peace came the evaporation of the market which had made the farmer so prosperous. The lack of demand for wheat and other staple crops caused depression for the farmers. The new prosperity was based more on the sale of automobiles, radios, and electricity than on agriculture. Mechanization had helped the farmer. It made the work easier, but it also meant that fewer hands were needed. The farmers were disenchanted and afraid, and they campaigned without success for federal aid. For hundreds of thousands, the solution would mean leaving a life which had become a thankless occupation. Many would be drawn to the city by the glittering promise of prosperity, for the city was the loom that was weaving the new fabric of society. Much of the prosperity of the decade was produced by the automobile. Millions were made and sold. Car sales stimulated other industries as well, for cars meant gas, and gas meant oil, and rubber, glass, and steel. When we had a good idea, mass production multiplied it by millions. Business was the religion of the 20s. Machinery is the new messiah, Henry Ford told us. Calvin Coolidge agreed. The man who builds a factory builds a temple, Coolidge said, and the man who works there worships there. The new uniform of the decade was the business suit, and for the first time, millions of men bought them, not from the tailor, but right off the rack. Dressing right meant business success, and in the 20s, no professional was more greatly admired than the businessman. Businessmen were builders, doers of great things, men of vision with their eyes on the future. Millions of businessmen joined service clubs like Rotary and Kiwanis. These were men who were quite sure that strength of character could be measured by a handshake. What mattered to many women was the right to vote. The 19th Amendment guaranteed that right and was the law of the land as the 20s began. Though women in some western states had been voting for years, most American women cast their ballots in 1920 for the first time. Women also ran for office. First woman governor was elected in 1924. A few women had unusual occupations, like directing traffic as policewomen in New York City. Though some would become doctors and lawyers, most women who went to work in the 20s worked in laundries, bakeries, or in other blue-collar jobs. If you lived in a city, you might get a job as a telephone operator, a clerk, or a stenographer. Despite the reputation that all women in the 20s were flappers with newfound freedoms, most women had traditional roles, which included grocery shopping. In the 20s, millions of women fed their families with food from the Piggly Wiggly, or the A&P. Chain stores were spreading across the country with standard products on their shelves. You could buy the same brand of cornflakes, cookies in Iowa as your Aunt Clara did in New York. There were lots of products to choose from, and manufacturers spent millions on ads that told us which to buy. The appeal of ads was irresistible. We bought things that promised to make life easier and more comfortable, and with satisfaction guaranteed. that showed we were successful and had good taste. In the 20s, we thought it was important to be modern. We saw these ads in magazines, in the pages of Life, Saturday Evening Post, and dozens more that were delivered to our door. We may not have been able to buy everything we saw, but we could dream. The magazines were cheap, and it was from their pages that the growing middle class built its image of itself, an image of prosperity. For most middle-class families, prosperity meant radios, automobiles, and telephones, for these were the things that meant convenience to the modern family. Almost every family had a car, and 3 out of 4 bought their cars on the installment plan. Used cars were sold too. The first car many families bought was second-hand. By the end of the decade, there were 26 million cars and trucks on American roads. If you lived in one of the new suburbs, you might use your car to drive to work or to visit friends on Sunday afternoon. Gasoline was still only 25 cents a gallon. And we used a lot of it, especially in the cities. City streets were crowded as never before. We were fast becoming a nation on wheels.
So what do you think of that, huh? We lived an interesting life in the 1920s. Life was good. A lot of new inventions. Just incredible to think that the 1920s and how industrial it was. I also do a lecture on the inventions of the 1920s, which I love. I find it very interesting. I remember being a kid, and I'm sure some of you, depending on your age, remember the Iceman coming to deliver ice so we could, keep that freezer ice cold. And we have our milk and our cream delivered every morning. So, and the eggs. Don't forget the delivery of eggs. And the Fuller Brush Man. I can go on and on and on. But anyway, this I think you're going to really love. I just fell in love with this film, America in Color in the 1920s. You know, a lot of the old films are being colorized. It's a new type of technique. And it just brings everything, whether it's war or whether it's life, daily life in the 1920s, as you'll see, everything comes to life because we see it the way it was. All right, so let's look at the America in Color in the 1920s. Enjoy this, and I'll see you on the other side.
This is the story of America, seen in color for the first time. It's the Roaring Twenties. The country is flourishing. And the economy isn't the only thing roaring. Henry Ford ignites the auto industry. Radio unifies the nation.
Dempsey's base, he lands a right. Dempsey comes back.
As Charles Lindbergh ushers in the era of aviation. Americans are celebrating good times.
What's the greatest country in the whole world?
But progress also brings peril. Prohibition makes Al Capone a celebrity gangster. And the Ku Klux Klan marches the streets of the capital. Then, after 8 years of incredible prosperity, comes Black Tuesday and the crash of '29. This is the story of the 20s, as you've never seen them before.
I want us to recapture that.
New York, 1919. 2 million U.S. soldiers return victorious from World War I. They parade through Madison Square, optimistic about a young country on the rise. At the start of the decade, New York is the world's largest financial market, the beating heart of American capitalism. But both veterans and bankers are in for an unpleasant surprise. At noon on September 16, 1920, a horse-drawn wagon passing by lunchtime crowds stops across from the J.P. Morgan Bank at 23 Wall Street. Then, an explosion kills 38 and leaves 143 seriously wounded. Anarchists targeting the rich are the prime suspects, but no one is ever arrested. A flash of terror, quickly forgotten. Trading resumes the next day as the wolves of Wall Street launch a decade of unprecedented growth. But before the party comes a hangover. The end of wartime production slams the brakes on America's economy. Nearly half of returning soldiers find themselves unemployed and relying on bread lines. Many Americans are hurting financially. For those who can't afford leather shoes, an enterprising store offers a cheaper alternative: clogs made of wood. In March 1921, new President Warren G. Harding promises to put things right for America, a return to normalcy. Historians will later view Harding as one of America's worst presidents. But during his term, he benefited from an age of rapid innovation. One early adopter is a Fox Movie-Tone news cameraman, Harry Birch of Chicago. When he's not filming newsreels, he takes some of the earliest known home movies, featuring his wife Lucille and son Bill. Cars are becoming so popular that even young Bill has one. His dad has the must-have marvel of the day, the revolutionary Ford Model T. Its designer is Henry Ford, the greatest engineer of his era. By the 1920s, Ford and his Tin Lizzie have turned America into a nation of car owners.
The young man makes up his mind to work. There's no limit to what he can do.
In 1913, Ford had introduced the moving assembly line, a revolution in auto manufacturing. Workers used to make one car at a time. Ford puts them in workstations, installing each part of the chassis as it moves down a line. It's up to 4 times faster than the old way. black paint is cheap and durable. Ford famously says customers can have any color they like, so long as it's black. By 1920, a new car rolls off the line every 2 hours. And over half of all cars in America are Model Ts. Each one is simple, reliable, and durable. Important in a nation where less than 2% of the roads are suitable for driving. Ford also revolutionizes business practices. He gives employees a 5-day work week, their first weekends off, and pays them enough to afford their own Model T, selling at a little over $300. In his company newsletter, Ford says, "It is high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege." Millions of sales turn Detroit into a boomtown, and Ford into a billionaire. It's a new age of great industrialists. In 1921, Ford joins tire magnate Harvey Firestone on the left and inventor Thomas Edison on the right on a trip to the Catskills. Even President Harding pays a visit. As 4 of the most powerful people on the planet take a break from the stresses of work and enjoy the great outdoors, across the country, new roads emerge to accommodate millions of new car owners. By 1922, the economy is kicking into high gear. But there's one business that won't be joining the boom. Just 2 years earlier, Prohibition became law. It bans the production and sale of alcohol. This 1922 footage in Long Beach, California, shows the police destroying $30,000 worth of liquor. This is some of the earliest film ever of Prohibition. America is again a productive nation, and many believe it's also become a sober nation as well. But for some, the party never ends. It just goes underground. In this rare home movie, the Addams family of Brattleboro, Vermont, films a party where the liquor flows freely. A loophole in the law allows people to drink existing supplies at home. Even manufacturers find workarounds. In Napa Valley, vineyards stop making wine and start selling bricks of dried grapes with instructions.
Say, Lucille, what do they do with all these grapes?
Well, my father buys them to make grape juice. He would.
Adding water and 3 weeks in a cupboard makes wine. But even these loopholes don't meet the enormous demand. There's a growing black market, and organized crime is happy to satisfy the country's thirst. By the end of the 20s, Al Capone is earning millions of dollars a year from bootlegging. He's not the only one. Competition leads to gang wars. Nearly 600 mobsters die in Chicago alone over the course of the decade. The violence does nothing to slow the demand. The quest for a stiff drink gives birth to the speakeasy, password-protected entertainment with a shot of freedom. For women who just won the right to vote in 1920, these underground bars inspire a new, uninhibited lifestyle. One that will shock the more conservative sectors of society. As the writer Dorothy Parker puts it, she's not what Grandma used to be. The Flapper, a hit movie, gives a name to this brash new generation of women. Flappers cast aside much of what society considers proper behavior. They wear short dresses, bobbed hair, and lavish makeup, celebrating a newfound sexuality. The cosmetics industry booms as more women adopt the flapper style. Cigarettes become a symbol of liberation, and women embrace the image. The jazz age is in full swing. Most Americans have never had it so good. But while the flappers celebrate their social revolution, other Americans are reacting to change in a very different way. In the rural South, a dark force is rising, and a dormant volcano is about to explode. It's 1923, and America is on the upswing. Well-paid jobs abound as industry thrives and a largely unregulated stock market booms. Then, in August, President Harding dies suddenly from a heart attack. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, carries the torch of small government and big business.
One of the greatest favors that can be bestowed on the American people is economy in government.
Silent Cal famously says, "The chief business of the American people is business." For most Americans, the future is bright. But the country's political, social, and economic institutions strongly favor white citizens over people of color. Nowhere is it worse than for blacks living in the Jim Crow South. Many live and work in tough, segregated conditions. As these rare recordings show, the work songs have changed little since the time of slavery. In South Carolina, they lay the tracks for America's railways. And in Port Norris, New Jersey, they shuck oysters for wealthy diners. some African-American communities are prospering, like the residents of Greenwood, a suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Here, former slaves were given land after the Civil War, and this rare footage shows the thriving town they built. A remarkable Baptist pastor named Solomon Sir Jones is the pioneering filmmaker. His footage was lost for more than 50 years. Jones captures the bustling life of Greenwood, which could be any American small town. But Tulsa's whites don't like what they see. In May 1921, after a black man is accused of assaulting a white woman, a white mob rampages through the city. For a night and a day, they loot and burn Greenwood. A Fox News crew captures the only surviving footage. It is the bloodiest racial massacre in American history, leaving nearly 300 dead. Behind the violence is a terrifying force, born in the 19th century, but until now, silent. The second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. News photographers capture a Klan march in Tulsa 1 year after the riots. The Klan appeals to white Americans who feel threatened by the fast pace of change in the 20s. Born in the South, the KKK spreads north. Its members promote what they call 100% Americanism, targeting not just blacks, but Catholics, Jews, immigrants. At the height of its power, newsreels capture 40,000 Klansmen and women massing in support of white supremacy on the streets of Washington, D.C. By 1924, its membership reaches a staggering 4 million. The KKK will remain a force of bigotry in this country for generations to come. Racial tensions in the South and bountiful jobs in the North prompt many African Americans to uproot their families. Nearly 1.6 million people choose to move in what becomes known as the Great Migration. It transforms neighborhoods, like New York's Harlem. Black Americans bring their culture and music with them: blues, jazz. Not for the last time, black music is adopted by white America. In one of the earliest recordings of an all-white jazz band, Ben Burney and his orchestra play their 1925 hit, Sweet Georgia Brown. Jazz finds a new home in the raucous speakeasies and nightclubs of the cosmopolitan cities. A flamboyant former actress named Texas Guinan runs New York's 300 Club, often greeting her customers with, "Hello, suckers."
Before I start to sing this song, I want it understood that no sucker in this room has been mentioned how it works.
Black music, illegal booze, and liberated women make her a fortune.
What's the greatest country in the whole world?
At Guinan's 300 Club, the Roaring Twenties reach a colorful crescendo. Parts of the United States are evolving faster than ever before. In the middle of the decade, a new technology will unite the country and create new heroes. As 1925 begins, prosperity and new inventions revolutionize everyday life in America. Modern conveniences we now take for granted appear for the first time. Vacuum cleaners replace carpet beaters. Electric refrigerators, ovens, and washing machines save hours of work. But the invention that brings the whole country together is radio. This is Radio Row, New York City's Cortlandt Street, the world's largest collection of electronic stores. It will remain this way until 1966, when it's leveled to make way for the World Trade Center. Shop after shop competes by selling different models. And here, actual sounds of street crowds listening to a radio broadcast. Advertisers quickly see new and exciting ways to reach a massive audience. On Christmas Eve, 1926, Wheaties airs the first commercial jingle, and the cereal becomes the most popular in America. It's branded the Breakfast of Champions, and soon features prominent sports figures on each box. The best breakfast food in the land. For the first time, Americans can listen to sports events as they happen, anywhere in the country. Especially the national pastime, baseball. And players quickly become American heroes. None is bigger than Babe Ruth. No radio recordings of games exist, and this footage is rare. Ruth starts his career as a pitcher, but soon evolves into the greatest slugger the game has ever seen. In 1920, his first season with the Yankees, he leads the league with 54 home runs. The next highest total is 19.
Hello, honey. How'd you like that one?
He and his wife, Claire, are a glamorous power couple.
Well, I'm going out now and try to make another one for you. All right, darling.
He sets one of the game's greatest records in September of 1927 by hitting 60 home runs in a single season. And the Yankees reward him with a contract for $80,000 per year, an astronomical amount at that time. By 1926, 5 million homes own a radio, a staggering increase on the 2,000 homes at the start of the decade. Just in time for one of the century's greatest sporting controversies. Boxer Jack Dempsey has won 66 bouts over 13 years. Born in poverty in Colorado, Dempsey has Irish, Cherokee, and Jewish ancestry. He's a strong, offensive fighter, making it to the top through skill and guts. His 1921 victory over French boxer Georges Carpentier is the first $1 million match. It turns him into a national star.
Announcer Joe Humphreys died away. The Argentinian and the champion staged the most savage slugfest ever witnessed.
Dempsey doesn't believe in defense. Relentless attack is his style.
Murderous right, cruel left hooks crashed on Firpo's body and jaw. Dempsey's pile-driving fist battered him to the canvas time and again.
The public loves it, and him.
He was up, down again, and...
In 1926, he fights Gene Tunney, a former U.S. Marine with 64 wins under his belt. Tunney shocks Dempsey and the nation with his victory. A year later, in 1927, 50 million Americans tune into the rematch in Chicago. This is the radio commentary they heard.
They're coming together. This is the 7th round. They're up. Dempsey came into Tunney. Both of them shot.
Dempsey is in black shorts with a red trim. In the 7th round, he floors Tunney. He's supposed to go to a neutral corner before the 10-second count can begin. But he doesn't move for 4 crucial seconds. It buys Tunney extra time. He's down for a full 13 seconds before getting up. Becomes known as the long count. The fight continues, and Tunney wins on points, despite being down longer than the allowed count of 10.
It's all out, and Dempsey is practically...
Ignoring a press storm, Dempsey accepts the decision gracefully. His attitude in defeat is applauded and made famous by the radio. He retires at age 33, a wealthy, popular symbol of the American dream. World-beating sports stars, technological innovation, and a booming economy. By the mid-1920s, the country is brimming with confidence. But nature is about to deliver a shattering blow to one of its greatest success stories. It's 1926, and Miami's economy is soaring, fueled by Northerners attracted to its tropical climate and pristine beaches. Through the decade, the population grows from 30,000 to over 100,000 residents. Its blue skies, crystal waters, and swaying palm trees make it the winter party destination for the wealthy. On September 17th, sun worshippers have no idea that a devastating hurricane is sweeping their way. That night, a 60-mile-wide Category 4 hurricane smashes into the city. Nearly 400 people are killed, and 43,000 left homeless. News cameraman Ralph Earl is trapped for 6 hours, capturing these images of Miami underwater. It is, perhaps, the earliest known storm chasing footage. Earl, on the left, flies his shocking footage himself to be distributed to the 20,000 movie theaters across the country. The The rebuilding cost reaches $109 million, $165 billion today. Worse even than Hurricane Katrina. The University of Miami had just opened a year earlier and christened its teams the Hurricanes. As Miami rebuilds, 1,000 miles to the north, one man sets out to prove that the nation's spirit is unbroken. This is 24-year-old Charles Lindbergh in 1926, the aviator's earliest known film footage. He's just a year out of Army flight training school and already dreaming of making history. Lindbergh wants to win a $25,000 prize for the first solo non-stop flight from New York to Paris. At stake is the future of air travel. Transatlantic ocean liners are safe and reliable, but slow. Planes are considered too dangerous. 6 pilots have already died attempting the 3,600-mile crossing. Long Island, May 20th, 1927. Lindbergh readies the Spirit of St. Louis, his $10,000 custom-built monoplane. "500 spectators have gathered to see him off. On board, he's packed 5 ham sandwiches to keep him going. At 7:52 a.m., he's off. And after a few bounces, aloft, just barely clearing telephone lines. He will be in the air for 33.5 hours. No radio and only a compass. The press dub him the Flying Fool. At 10:24 p.m. in Paris, tens of thousands witness his triumphant night landing. Instantly, 25-year-old pilot, now dubbed Lucky Lindy, becomes the most famous American in the world. President Coolidge orders the USS Memphis to bring him back to New York in style. Four million people line Fifth Avenue for a ticker-tape parade. He epitomizes the nation, young, handsome, and brave. And his daring feat proves that flight is the future of travel. Congress awards Lindbergh the Medal of Honor. And the following year, he becomes Time magazine's first ever Man of the Year. For 3 months, he tours the country, visiting every state. 1 in 4 Americans sees Lindy on his Guggenheim tour. The Hines family from Portland, Maine, is among them. On July 24th, they capture Lindbergh's arrival in Portland in a home movie. The Hines have profited from creating a successful hand cream business. A new generation of women wanting their product and the power of mass production has made them and others rich and utterly transformed America. There are now 20 million cars crowding into American cities. Accidents become common, as pedestrians have to learn to watch out for cars, and vice versa. There's no such thing as a driver's test. Faced with this new threat to public safety, authorities turn to innovation, like the traffic light, as seen here on New York's Fifth Avenue. Soon, traffic cops and stop signs begin to appear throughout the country. Still, fatalities increase from 12,000 in 1920 to over 30,000 by the end of the decade. Education campaigns try to highlight the dangers by putting totaled cars on display, some even shaming the drivers. In Portland, Maine, the Hines family shares in the national tragedy. Their son, William, is seen here in home movie footage at age 5 in 1924. A year later, a Ford Model T strikes and kills him on Vaughan Street. He's the fourth boy in the area to be struck by a car within 24 hours. But car culture isn't the only trend shaping the country. A soaring economy has construction reaching for the sky. In Manhattan, a series of ambitious skyscrapers rise up, each competing to claim the title of tallest in the world. The Chrysler Building becomes the first man-made structure to breach 1,000 feet. It's a leading example of Art Deco architecture that remains iconic to this day. This is rare footage of its famous eagles being installed on the 61st floor. Like the Statue of Liberty, they're thinner than they seem. The working men who construct the buildings, known as roughnecks, are a special breed.
Pretty high up there.
They work without harnesses, safety ropes, or hard hats, spending 8-hour shifts in the clouds with no bathroom breaks. Workers fling red-hot rivets by hand through the air. These jobs are so dangerous that 2 out of 5 fall to their deaths or end up disabled. Across town on 34th Street, construction begins on an enormous 102-floor office building, intended to be a symbol of New York's wealth and power. Former New York Governor Al Smith actively promotes the construction.
As fast as human ingenuity, brains, and ability can bring it about, there will tower on this corner the Empire State Incorporated, the largest office building in the world.
But the boom is a bubble about to burst. Nearly 80% of goods are bought on credit. Most Americans have no savings at all. Consumers are stretching themselves thin. And with a runaway bull market, few realize what's about to come. The skyscrapers crown a hollow economy that is about to spin dangerously out of control. In 1927, much of America looks like smooth sailing. Like the mighty Mississippi, the country seems to be flowing toward a prosperous future. For generations, Americans have built their livelihoods along their longest river, stretching more than 2,300 miles from northern Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. The river offers jobs, food, and a distinctive way of life, all protected by a system of levees that aim to control the river's flow. But nature is about to show the limits of human intervention. 8 months of extreme rainfall swell the river to unprecedented levels. Then, on April 21st, the waters burst through the levees. The devastation is staggering. An area the size of New England, over 70,000 square miles, is underwater. 1,000 are dead, mostly black families. 700,000 are homeless, and there are more than $1 billion in damages. This is the U.S. Army Signal Corps footage of the aftermath. In all, 10 states are affected, with a fifth of Arkansas underwater. Nevertheless, President Coolidge refuses to commit federal money to help. He believes disaster relief is the job of charities and private business, not government. Temporary camps are set up in the disaster zone. But many opt to migrate north rather than to stay and try to rebuild. The Great Mississippi Flood serves as a warning of how fast fortunes can change. But for much of the country, the good times keep rolling along. Wall Street is booming. Trading volumes are so high that in 1928, the New York Stock Exchange introduces tickers that can print 500 characters a minute, twice as fast as before. Millions of investors are out to get rich quick, often by borrowing money and buying on margin. For the first time, Americans can buy now and pay later. But the market gains are driven by optimism, not on the strength of the companies. Few worry. As long as there are buyers, it seems like a license to print money. By September 1929, the Dow Jones has tripled since 1924. It seems like the bull market will last forever. What most investors don't know is there are too many goods to sell. Total car sales have dropped 30%. In Detroit, unsold cars pile up in scrapyards. At the sound of the opening bell on Thursday, October the 24th, 1929, there are no buyers, only sellers. The market falls by 11%. In 2 hours, $9 billion is lost. Terrified banks recall payment from traders who have borrowed money. Most can't pay, leaving the banks in crisis. On Tuesday, the 29th, the New York Stock Exchange goes into a total spiral. Brokers beg to sell at any price. It comes to be known as Black Tuesday. $25 billion evaporate almost overnight. This isn't just about Wall Street. Banks will shut down all across the country. $140 billion in savings will disappear. ordinary people are ruined. Assistant Secretary of Commerce Julius Klein reaches out through radio to restore calm.
That regardless of regrettable stock market gyrations, the position of commerce and industry throughout the country is fundamentally sound.
He's wrong. After the Roaring Twenties, Americans will come to know their next chapter as the Great Depression. It's a defining time for a young nation, and she will revive. But the future will not be easy. When the giant Empire State Building opens the following year, it has few tenants.
We are about to officially open the Empire State Building, the largest and most beautiful office building in the world.
It stands lifeless, mocked as the empty State Building. It will take 2 full decades until 1950 before it turns a profit. America's 10-year party has led to a hangover affecting millions. It's the greatest boom to bust in history.
Isn't it an incredible film? One of my favorites as a professor. I just love showing that to students. Just absolutely amazing the way that color brings everything more to reality. But, you know, the 1920s, really, really good times. Amazing inventions, a big jump or leap forward. But it came crashing down. And we have to be very careful of how we move forward. We have to take care of each other. So you guys take care, and I'll see you real soon.